So we're going to continue with the theme that Trudy had raised of dependent origination, which is considered to be a very deep subject, so that even around the time of the Buddha, people would say to him, "Oh, I get it," and he'd say, "No, no, no, it goes deeper than that." So if you don't understand it, you're in good company. You were probably part of those people around the Buddha who didn't understand it and got reborn again and came back to InsightLA to try to figure it out. And the gist of dependent origination, or the cycle of interdependence, is that it is a description of how suffering is created in our lives and how we can become liberated from suffering. So it has a really practical import. And if you've ever seen the image mostly painted in the Tibetan tradition of the wheel of birth and death that has the Yama, the Lord of Death, holding this wheel, and then there are all the different realms or experiences we can have inwardly or outwardly, and then there are the links of dependent origination around it, showing how birth and death happen. And while we could talk about it in Might some morning about birth and death and what happens when you die, that might be of interest to some of you. The other important meaning of this is that we're born and die in every moment and every day. Every breakfast you're born anew, and what are you going to do with this day? And so the teaching of liberation in dependent origination is also a teaching of interconnection. That we're not separate from one another or from the matrix of the world, and to understand how things are interconnected is really critical for our own inner freedom. And there's no such thing, no matter how much a cowboy out there might think that they're an independent actor, they're sitting on a saddle that goes back for thousands of years of humans learning how to tan leather, and they're sitting on a horse, if they are, with the thousands of years of what people learn to domesticate animals. And they're also, moving through a landscape that has been altered by all the other people who'd been there before, not to speak of other beings. So the whole notion of separateness is a kind of fiction. There's a lovely new book by Koshin Ellison where he writes about or starts talking about his early life and his family who were Holocaust survivors, and in the family there was a lot of unprocessed trauma, and then he was bullied in school and so forth, and he became a monk in some way to get out of all of that. But anyway, he got interested in Buddhism when he was young, and he thought of himself as an outsider. He would become a monk and leave this messy culture. At age 18, I was on a bus in Colorado, and a warm-faced woman struck up a conversation with me. I'd started practicing Buddhism by then, and she had too, so she asked me which community I was affiliated with. I responded, I have a lot of teachers that I've read and named them, but I don't practice with any one community in particular. Oh, she said, so you're a lone wolf. Yes, I nodded and smiled. She went on, you know what's interesting about lone wolves? They're sick. Wolves are pack animals, and they often mate for life. So if you see a wolf by itself, then there's actually something wrong with it. I'll always remember being on that bus, its funky greyhound smells all around me, and being totally struck dumb by her comment. Holy shit. I had to look at my life anew. So the reality is that we're interwoven together with one another and with our environment. And the way that the Buddha describes this, Trudy spoke about it last week, is because of this, that appears. It's called causes and conditions. Things don't happen at random, but a series of causes and conditions lead to another series of experiences. And dependent origination isn't a sequence that you take apart and say, this brings that, brings that, brings that. It's how it all fits together, just the same way if you have a car, you can't take the cylinder out and say, well, this is where it starts, or the gasoline, or, the electricity if you have a hybrid or whatever, or the carburetor or the fuel jets and so forth. They all work together, and you can examine how the different pieces allow you to use it and to drive it. So dependent origination, the first link, again, in this system that's really an interdependent system, is the link of ignorance. And this is what creates suffering. We can see it in all kinds of ways. It's the ignorance of believing that we're separate from the world. And that kind of ignorance of the sense of separation leads to climate destruction and racism and warfare and all of those kinds of things, because we actually believe that we can be separate from others. It's the illusion of permanence, that we think things are, there was the good old days and we can make them again, or we'll keep them, or that things will last. It's the illusion of lasting satisfaction, that you'll get something, whatever is really great, and then it will stay. Please raise your hand if you've had that experience. It's the illusion of a kind of solidity of the world, so that the Buddha was walking with his monks and nuns along the side of the Ganges and said, do you see the bubbles floating along the river? They said, yes. He said, examine them closely. Can you see anything solid about them? He said, if you look closely, they're empty, they're temporary, they exist in a bubble-like form for a short time, and then they vanish. He said, now begin to look at your human experience. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, sounds, tastes, intuitions, all the things that make up your life, and the more closely you examine, the more you will see that they're empty like bubbles, because they don't last, and neither do you. Just in case you hadn't remembered that. So there's ignorance because we're not seeing this is the way the world is. It's like bubbles. What happened to yesterday? What happened to last week? What happened to your crises and your joys and so forth? They're gone. They're back with Y2K, right? And the pyramids and, Kublai Khan and the dinosaurs. Everything appears in the moment and vanishes, and this is the reality. And so it's another form of illusion. It's said, it's as if we're walking along at night and it's somewhat dark and we see a coiled form and we recoil from it, thinking it's a snake. And then in the morning when we go out on the path, we realize it was just the hose or a rope that was coiled. We live in illusion, said Tibetan Lama Kalu Rinpoche. There is a reality, but we don't see it. We live in illusion and the appearances in our mind. When you understand, you'll see that you are nothing. And being nothing, you are everything. That is all. And what he means is you'll see that your whole sense of self is constructed, but it's not separate from the rest of it. You are part of everything, and in some way, there's nothing solid about it. And yet, you also have to, as our dear friend Ram Dass says, you need to remember emptiness in your Buddha nature and your social security number, right? You have to live in these two dimensions of reality. So what this means is that when you see clearly independent origination, you cling less because you realize things are going to change. You hold them more lightly. You understand what Ajahn Chah called the wisdom of uncertainty, that it's uncertain. What's going to happen tomorrow? Nobody knows. And instead of clinging on, you become more relaxed, you become more gracious, because the world has suffering and joy, birth and death, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. It's the way that it is. And seeing it with clarity brings a tremendous inner freedom, because then you're not struggling with reality. Now, based on ignorance, then there arises in dependent origination consciousness or knowing, starting to see or experience the world. It doesn't mean awakened consciousness, but consciousness itself that not seeing. There's certain forms of, depending how, let me see how to put it, depending whether there's clarity and understanding or delusion, different forms of consciousness arise. It can be the consciousness of separation or hate or racism or so forth, conflict. It can be the consciousness of connection and understanding. And then based on those forms of consciousness, we start to, or conditioned with that, we can start to see how the world arises through our senses. And so there are the different sense doors of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and so forth. Now, what's true about these links of dependent origination that I'll name is that liberation or inner freedom comes wherever you pay attention and notice how you can get caught in it. You get caught in ignorance and, false beliefs. You can get caught in the sense experience in some ways. You can either get caught in one fashion with the sense experience by loving it and clinging to it and wanting it to keep so that it becomes kind of an addiction, not realizing that it's temporary. The poem from the great Zen poet Ikkyo, he says, "Even in Kyoto, I long for Kyoto." All right? Because the longing is there. It's not the experience. So we can get caught in that. Or we can get lost in our thoughts about it, which one of my teachers said, how does the modern world look to you from a perspective of a forest monastic, meditation master? And he said, the modern world, lost in thought. It's like we're not even here with our senses. So to find liberation with senses means we actually start to pay attention to the reality of our life and not all the stories we have about it. And then we see the eyes of the person next to us. We see the changing of the seasons, the changing of the light, the reality of what we're in rather than being lost in all of that. We actually come closer to the reality of experience and to the suchness of it, as it's said in Zen. So the answer to a question about enlightenment, a Zen poet might say, the pine tree in the garden. That's the answer. What is enlightenment? It's things the way they are, rather than how we want them to be. And then with the senses, there's contact and feeling. We get the impressions of sights and sounds and tastes and smells and so forth. And this is a place where we get caught the most, which Trudy has talked about, because every contact has a pleasant or unpleasant or neutral quality. When it's pleasant, what do? We want more of it. And when it's unpleasant, we fear it or try to get rid of it or push it away and so forth. And so we're constantly in reaction to a world of praise and blame and pleasure and pain and gain and loss. And so we suffer because we're trying to make the world something that it's not. It actually is the way that it is. And we can instead sit with loving awareness and a compassionate heart and say, this is the way that it is. Now let me add my piece to the causes and conditions that bring well-being rather than fight and struggle with ourselves and with one another. Based on contact and feelings, and with contact, usually we blame the outside world for our suffering. I remember being in the monastery, and there was that time, there was a big wedding at a village across the rice paddies, but they had huge loudspeakers, and there we were trying to meditate. This particular monastery I was in, and it was like bad, low-class movie music and whatever, all night long party, and we're trying to be this was a retreat center I was living in. We were trying to be very wise and so forth. And there's all this blasting music. And one of the monks went to the teacher and said that, that music is it's really bothering me. It's a fair statement. And the teacher leaned back and looked at me and said, well, actually, who's bothering who? Is the music bothering you? Or are you bothering it? I mean, it's just music. What's your problem, right? It's just sound on the ear. So we can get entangled with the way we think the world should be, or through the practice of mindfulness and loving awareness, we can be with the world actually as it is. And that also brings liberation. So then, based on feelings, there's craving and clinging. You may have noticed that. I want to keep it the way it is. I don't want to let go of it. And at its extreme, it's addiction. But in many ways, it's a driving force in modern culture and our lives to hold on and want things and so forth, as if fulfilling all that will make everything solid and permanent and happy and lasting and will be good forever after. And it doesn't work that way. When we can see the movement of clinging and craving, go, oh, that's craving with loving awareness. That's clinging. That's pleasure and that's pain. And rest in the place of awareness rather than in the middle of the reaction to it. Each of these places becomes an invitation to liberation. And if we're not paying attention, then out of our clinging and craving, we, quote, take birth, which is to say, we become the person who wants it and hates that and acts in this way, all out of our inner reactivity. And it doesn't mean that we can't care for our life, but we can hold it lightly, like the poem from Eduardo Galeano where he writes, the church says the body is a sin. Science says the body is a machine. Business says the marketplace says the body is a business, and the body says I am a fiesta, right? And so we can tend this body in all kinds of ways, as a business, as a machine, as as something sinful or whatever. Or we can see that this is life living through us, and we can hold it lightly in a very different way. And as we do with this loving awareness, we see the causes and conditions of things arising. We see that suffering is part of the game, as is joy. And we also realize that we have the capacity, as the Buddhist teaching points to find liberation exactly where we are, in the middle of our experience, by recognizing these different causes and conditions and seeing where we're reactive and caught and frightened and so forth, and saying, oh, that's fear arising. I understand that. That's attachment arising. And instead of believing it or living in it, we become the loving awareness that says, oh, attachment, but we don't hold it, so we don't go down that road. Or fear, oh, fear, I know you, that's natural. But we don't have to believe all the stories. As Mark Twain said, my life has been filled with terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened, right? And we have all those stories about it. And the teacher that Trudy and I first started to study with, a Zen master named Dae Seung San Sansanim, this Korean master, where we met in 1973. He wrote in a little poem, once a great man sat under a tree, saw the morning star, and gained enlightenment. He absolutely believed his eyes, his ears, his nose, his mouth. The sky is blue, the earth is brown, everything is just as it is, and he was free. Something like this. Everything is just like this. Which is to say that there's an ability to see the mystery of the world and how it creates itself from causes and conditions, so you can plant seeds that will bring benefit, or in ignorance and clinging you can create more suffering. And this is all possible in the human heart when we learn the quality of loving awareness, of mindfulness, and discover that is a gateway or an invitation to a freedom in the exact place that we are.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome, dear.
I know, you want to clap.
Yeah.
I know the talks, they come out so perfect. It was beautiful. Yes, I embarked on this topic of dependent origination thinking we would talk about it for a week and then move on. And I realized actually we could talk about it for the year. And
But we're not, right?
no, we're not. And the good news of why we're not is that you actually have to meditate a lot to feel it in your bones, to really get it, as opposed to understand it. Understanding it conceptually is really important, though. It's not something to, poo-poo and say, well, that's not the real practice. It's important because it helps us set our intention for what we want to do in our practice. And we have so much freedom in our culture. When these teachings, in the time of the Buddha, when he lived, people really did not have any lifestyle choices. You were born into a caste, you were born into a family system, a family livelihood, and that dictated the duties and activities of your life, really, of your role in life. And choice was very limited. And this wheel of life that Jack was talking about, I'll bring a picture of it next week. It's fascinating, actually. The 12 links of dependent origination are on the outside rim, but the whole wheel is being held in this giant mouth with fangs that belongs to what? Yama, the Lord of Death. Understanding that, that's our motivation, I guess I would say, for this life. And those links, they illustrate the way things happen, as I like to say, how one thing leads to another in life, but also deconstructing the process of how we perceive itself, how our habitual patterns are formed, and how they're maintained in a very automatic and repetitious way. It's not that we want to maintain our patterns. We don't have to think about it. They maintain themselves. And the beauty of this teaching is that the process can be reversed. You can look at the wheel this way, how it leads to suffering, and then you can trace the whole thing back to how it leads to freedom. So it's not a gloomy or hopeless teaching. It's just understanding the movement of how cause becomes effect, effect becomes cause, it's just, and then it just moves around again and again. And that's why the intention is so important, because as Jack was saying, there's places we can intervene really, really at any point. There's places where it's easier to interrupt that automatic cycling, especially through painful emotional patterns. But the easiest way is through intention, to just ask, what is your intention? And to really do that at the beginning of a sitting is helpful, because especially if we include an altruistic intention. Because the reality is we don't just sit for ourselves in the sense of this separate encapsulated thought world self. We sit to understand our interdependence and our interconnection with everything. And this really helps in hard times when we don't feel like sitting, or just boring times, or just times when we've lost interest in ourselves. I wouldn't say there's any boring time, but a time when we've lost interest for whatever reason. And then it's helpful, because I can practice if I think I'm practicing for the sake of other people sometimes, when I might not feel like doing it just for myself, that little small separate self. So I spoke, I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, I think it was the week before, about the Buddha's teaching to his son during the years when he was a single parent, about how to be sure that his actions are on a path that would lead him to happiness and well-being, as opposed to the opposite, which was to ask himself, at the beginning of doing anything, is this likely to go in that direction, or is it likely to go south in another direction that's not, I don't even like using south, anything that, right, let's just say in an unhappy or unhealthy direction, when you're about to do something, just checking in. And it's a powerful practice, especially in families, couples, around other people. What is my intention in saying this? Is it to get even? Is it to have the last word? Is it to brighten our world? What is my intention? And one of the images in this Wheel of Life for dependent origination, it shows a potter shaping clay on the potter's wheel. And so that's a helpful one too, because we are, each one of us, shaping the clay of our life. We're doing that. And so what's our intention as we mold that clay of our life? And I talked about the automatic reaction of, pleasant, unpleasant, having that bite of chocolate, pleasant, leading to craving. The question in this practice isn't to be or not to be. It's always and only really to cling or not to cling. To cling to myself and what I want, to cling to you and what you want, and having to bend myself around that. I mean, whatever it might be. But this is just an important element in seeing how do we free our hearts from discontent and dissatisfaction. And we hear about like desire is maybe not so good, but if we think of desire as just wanting contentment or wanting satisfaction, there's really nothing wrong with that, because it's the same thing with ignorance. Yes, ignorance is the beginning of leading into everything that's of suffering, but ignorance also, because it leads to suffering, leads to the wish to be free of that suffering. So it has that other side that can be helpful. When we look at it that way, there's no experience that can't contribute to our longing for freedom from dissatisfaction. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about was, just briefly, was the importance of the willingness to be uncomfortable. And I can't remember which week it was, but we were talking about how an article came out recently in one of the reputable, I don't know if it was Science, but magazine. It said that 25%, I don't know how they figure these things out, but 25% of meditators encounter unpleasant experiences. And we were just thinking 25%? I mean, wouldn't it be 100% when you sit down with yourself and start to look and see what makes you tick all too often, what that is? And so the importance of being willing to be with unpleasant experiences, unpleasant feelings, it isn't to rub our noses in them or torment ourselves. I remember when I practiced Zen very intensively, and I was at the Zen Center a lot, and one of my friends there, after a while she left, and she had been the head Dharma teacher at one point. She'd been a really strong practitioner. And I asked her, why did you leave? She said, oh, I just got sick of torturing myself. Okay, that's out of balance in the other direction. We aren't meant to be also just only suffering when we're meditating on our cushions. And sometimes during the meditation, I open my eyes and just peek at you. And and it's beautiful because you can see people's faces are relaxed, and you can just see everything. You can see the relaxation, and you can see the tension, and you can see sort of all of life in our faces as we sit. And if we're going to sit and really appreciate our aliveness and connect with all of life, some of it is going to be being with experiences that are uncomfortable. And when we sit, one meaning of mindfulness is we make an effort not to camouflage or mask or deny what's going on, what's actually happening. And we interrupt those cycles of addiction and dependence that Jack was talking about even if it's just momentarily, it's like a little, it's a glimpse of that door of freedom opening. And we cultivate this environment of more spaciousness. I think it was last week somebody brought up Suzuki Roshi's quote, the best way to control your cow is to give it a very big meadow. And it's the same when we watch our thinking. There is in the ancient texts, there's the example of a cow herd and the different kinds of attention that we need to bring to our practice. And it's like during the season when the crops are really growing, the cows have to be watched very carefully so they don't go eat the farmer's crops, right? So you have to really concentrate and watch the cows. But then once the harvest has happened, the cow herd can relax, and all the cow herd needs to know is the cows are there. That's all they need to know. And for our purposes sitting here, really, that's all we need to know. Our experience is here, whatever it may be. All we need to do is kind of know it. And of course, if our experience is traumatic and really severely traumatic, we will need therapy and some kind of companionship to help it stabilize, because the landscape can feel so terrifying and annihilating. But for garden variety, unpleasant experiences, we can learn to be comfortable with them, which of course makes them less unpleasant. We can become the potter shaping a really good, strong pot, a big, really good, strong container that can hold the challenges of healing and all the situations that overwhelmed us in the past, and especially when we were children. They overwhelmed us because, like us, our capacity for holding our attention steady in the midst of them was very little. But by developing this capacity to observe, like the cowherd, this capacity to observe with the intention, and the intention here is so important, the intention to understand what's happening, to know about it, to learn, instead of to judge, to criticize, to measure, to compare, right? All of that. And by developing that, our mindfulness grows, the cycles of suffering become clearer, which gives us more choice about whether we want to continue with them or not. And even we begin to see how we can reverse them. Jack tells the story, I can't remember it exactly, but it was about somebody who was, I don't know if they had an eating disorder, there was something about their eating, and then they decided that all that energy that they were devoting to, like thinking about food and gathering food, and maybe I've made this up. I don't know if this is actually your story or not, Jack. I think I'm conflating two stories, but I like what I'm creating anyway. It's an example of how we could turn an obsession into generosity, basically. Something that bothers us and obsesses us, we could turn into, I think in this case, they started a movement where people would say take the money they would use for a certain amount of food and give it to feed the hungry.
It was called Dieters Feed the Hungry.
Oh, dieters, that's what it was. Okay, that's why I thought of eating disorders. Sorry, but I associate dieting is a tricky thing. So, at least for us women, men can just skip lunch and they'll lose weight, but it's a little more challenging. Have the emphasis on weight. My mom used to, when I was actually not even such a young adult, she would look at two things when she first saw me, and one of them would be the size of my body, and the other would be what I was wearing. Now, I had a nice mom, but she was very focused on appearances because, she's raised in an era where that's what women thought about and were supposed to do. So she would notice if I had gained weight, but she would comment first thing. on whether I had looked larger or smaller. By the way, larger was bad, smaller was good. Um, you wouldn't immediately know that, but that's how it was. Then she would notice the clothing. You're such a pretty woman. Why are you wearing overalls? Or, something. This was an unpleasant experience. It really was. And finally, I realized I actually could train my mom. And I told her, when you greet me like that, it actually makes me want to turn around and get back in the car. I don't want it. It's like starts our visit off on so the wrong foot. I'm already mad at you. We haven't even gotten into the house. Um, so if you want me to come visit more often, which she really did, start with something else, like how nice it is to see each other, or, just something random like that, which is, I know what she was really feeling. She just felt, I don't know, it was her duty or something. So we're trying to develop this capacity to observe without judgment, or to observe our judgment without judgment. It's just another cow. All we have to do is know that it's there. And by being willing to do this, to be present with our experience simply because it is here, it's already here. So we have to make some relationship with it. And out of our willingness to be present with it, actually then deeper things can come to the surface. Things that if we're struggling on the surface of just whatever, with whatever appears, it's harder to go deep. And the deeper things are actually often the most creative and nourishing things that occur to us. They are insights often, and they can enrich our life and consciousness with understanding and wisdom. So this is the great work of dependent origination, of awareness. And a lot of our work consists of taking apart this belief that just because something's unpleasant, it's a story about how bad we are, how wrong we are, or just because it's good, it's not a story about how great we are or how sinful or whatever we concoct. The important thing, I think, along with intention, is seeing each of these links in our experience as causes and effects in a process, as opposed to, bits of experience that we identify with and make a story about how good or how bad we are as a self. So we're really looking at how things appear, how they develop and grow, how they disappear, more than the content of them, if that makes sense. And that's what I mean by process. And I guess the last thing that I want to say is that about ignorance, which is ignorance is based on having unwise friends. Isn't that interesting? I read this also in Buddhist psychology in the texts. And it's considered to be the main cause of ignorance, which in Buddhist psychology doesn't mean not knowing stuff or being uneducated. It means ignoring the truth of what's happening in experience, not seeing clearly how things are. That the biggest cause actually in our everyday lives is having unwise friendships. And so corollary is also true, that the antidote to ignorance is having wise friends. Wise and unwise are also defined as ethical or unethical. People up to something good or people who are up to no good. And so we should all really make friends with each other here, because just by definition of being here, we qualify as wise friends with integrity because we're choosing to be here. Now, we could be wise and have integrity at the beach, too. I thought about that this morning. But the formal practice is necessary for helping us then have it seep into our everyday life. All the elements are necessary. And The elements of your listening are necessary to our being able to speak. The elements of your caring about them are necessary to sharing the teachings and having them begin to seep more and more into our world so that we can inhabit a more compassionate and awake and caring world. And so that we can also look for examples of compassion and caring in our world instead of focusing on the assault of the constant assault, it seems, of bad news, dismaying news, disappointing news, especially from our leadership. Which, of course, then opens up a whole nother talk, which we will not have this week, about leadership. But again, what constitutes wise and compassionate leadership with integrity is the same thing as with friendship. So let's be friends with each other. Before you leave today, I would ask you to just say hi to somebody, or make friends with somebody that you haven't connected with before here. I always also want to remind you that if you are going to leave before we have our conversation and discussion with each other, that whether you're on the live stream or you're going to walk through the lobby, in the lobby there's an alms bowl where you are invited to support the teachings. And if you're live stream, I believe there is a donate button where you can do the same thing. So I'd like to open up for you for some conversation, dialogue, questions, and also if the live stream folks have any, please feel free to type them in and Angela will read them to us.
Thank you very much for the Dharma talk today. When you were talking about your mother judging your clothing, all I could think about growing up in Massachusetts was my mother would say, "Why can't you be more like Marcy Morelli?" Marcy, beautiful. She puts her makeup on nice. She's thin. She can swim.
Wow.
She can knit. She can sew. Why can't you be more like Marcy Morelli? Oh boy, did that trigger that memory. But it's funny. I mean, I'm laughing about it now.
Well, my mom actually stopped doing it. Did your mom ever?
Oh,
you
yeah.
Try? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. When I moved out. When I went on my own. When I moved to New York. Yeah.
Thank you.
But I accept it now as it's okay.
You have equanimity now. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for your talk.
Good morning, Nick.
So 3 weeks ago today, I was in East Africa, and we were on this Sunday morning at Olduvai Gorge, where the Leakeys had done their famous archaeology work and found sort of the origins of human beings. It was astounding. Among all the other things we had planned to do while we were in East Africa, Olduvai Gorge was just sort of a little bit of an aside. But I found it to be a really spiritual place.
Yes.
It was so peaceful and so tranquil. I mean, it's now a barren, rocky desert, which it wasn't 2.5 million years ago. But I really felt something there. Very unusual. I mean, it was like really outstanding. I mean, a real sense of connection to the planet.
Thank you. I have a friend who spent time there and actually wrote an entire book. He said it just downloaded into his consciousness right there about early people, the very first ones who were there, and the connection that he also felt with his so distant ancestors.
There's a beautiful little museum there. I mean, you are literally in the middle of nowhere. You're in the middle of nowhere. It's so barren otherwise. And there's this dioramic museum with explanations and pictures of what things were like. And, it's just among all the other outstanding things we saw, I mean, that to me was like really phenomenal.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
telling us. I'm glad you got to go there.
Hi, I'm Jerry. I don't know if you can hear me, but I have a 13-year-old daughter.
We actually need you to use the mic because of the live
here?
stream
Okay.
people. They can't hear you
I
otherwise.
have a 13-year-old daughter, and Trudy, your comment about commenting on dress just really struck me, because I never body shame her at all or say, hey, comment on her physique, but I often look at her and say, oh no, you can't possibly be putting that together in that way. And she's like, no, this is the way I want to dress, and I like this, as a typical, now teenager will do. But thank you very much. I will try to be more mindful the next time I talk with her.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Isabel, and this is the first time I'm speaking here. I'm not one to speak very often, but I couldn't sleep last night, and I was really grateful to not be able to sleep because I was so bothered by what happened yesterday with the killings
in El Paso.
And then as I was awake in the middle of the night, I heard about the second one. And again, I'm grateful that I have not become desensitized enough to not care and be able to sleep. But it also got me to think about coming here today, and I was really grateful that you spoke about having an intention in the sit. My intention was the person who actually committed the crime, because everyone else is sending a lot of goodwill to the victims and their families. But what is it that makes a 21-year-old have so much hatred? And what is it that we can do to counter that? It's not by putting the person on death row. It's by really having an intention for each one of us who is sitting here to reach out to someone who is politically, religiously, ethnically different from us. And we don't do that. We are in our bubble, and we are with like-minded people, with wise friends, as you said. And we take comfort in that. But living in that discomfort that you also mentioned means to really reach out to those that we dislike, with whom we completely disagree. And I thought that by speaking today, I would take the first step. I don't know what that second step would be, but we can't really be in this isolated world anymore where all these things happen and we just feel so superior in terms of being better than those who commit these crimes. But what is it that we can do as a group here, as the group of people who are really interested in mindful living, to infuse loving kindness into the world? And I don't know the answer. I just have the big question and this huge pain.
Well, thank you for voicing your pain and your question. It's interesting because before we came over here, I was having an exchange with our director, Mark Coburg, about, do we say something? What do we say? To offer prayers again every single time? Prayers, it just is sort of like not the right response. I mean, it's always a good response, but it's so many now, and it's so many now, and so we really aren't sure what to do and what is the right response at this point. But I will say, when I talk about wise friends who live with integrity, I think it was misleading for me to say, let's all be friends in this room, because what I did not mean is, let's only be friends in this room. It was sort of like, let's start here with people we don't know and who we might not think are the kind of people we would like to get to know, even because they look different from us, or because they're not our age, or because whatever it might be, right? So I really thank you for bringing that part forward. Do you want to?
Yeah. Oh. I also
quiet.
I'm very grateful for what you say. And I think that the first step is raising the question and making us all collectively conscious together that we have to hold this. And as you do, I start to feel the tremendous grief of it all. And the grief is for every part of it, for all the families, for the community. Imagine for the parents of that gunman or those gunmen, how it tears apart. And what is, you know, and you think about all the people who were in the Walmart, for example, every age, every political persuasion, different ethnicities, different backgrounds. And if I pay attention, I just start to feel our common humanity, that we're in it, and what grief and pain and sorrow, doesn't matter what their ideas or background is, they're human beings whose children have been hurt, or whose family members, whose community has been torn apart. And I think somehow your question invites us to feel this common humanity and compassion, and that becomes the energy where we can make a difference, and we can each do it in different ways. Some might in a political way for gun violence, some around mental health, some around reaching out to people that are different than ourselves, as you suggest. There are all kinds of important responses, and we have to look at, are we willing to do that? Are we willing to take some of our life energy and time and actually express that common humanity and care in a way that can plant the seeds, the causes or conditions of something going in the right direction rather than worse? So just gratitude for what you say.
And also is about, again, I can't remember which week it was, but we mentioned it again last week. Allie, who's sitting over totally sort of where you are, but completely on the other side by the wall, has offered to help anybody who wants to run for office by teaching them public speaking and how to do that. Were you here when he did? Yeah, okay. I was going to say, so maybe you should talk to him. Now that you've spoken, we can hear that you're perfectly eloquent and clear. So, yeah, think about that. Rosalie, and then...
Thank you very much for bringing that up. I don't know if it can be heard.
Yes.
Okay, good. I want to just remind everybody, including myself, that there is at InsightLA a program which works with people around the city who may not have access to mindful training, or if I'm not saying it right, I'm hoping that you'll correct me. It's Rosa or something it's with challenge communities. Rosemarie
Segura is the director of Insight in Action.
And interestingly, having come from an education background, I know that when you send it out to the universe, things happen. And so it seems to me that program sends it out to the community. You never know who you're going to reach. And maybe there's somebody who could go either way, as this young man did, and that it would help him go in a wise way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I know this sounds rather naive, but having spent my entire life as a Jewish secular humanist and a Buddhist, I have a really hard time wrapping my head around the destructiveness, not of a 21-year-old. I get that, because this is a disenfranchised, probably young man who is hearing hate, and it becomes kind of like, I mean, from what I understand, it's almost like, it's a game. Oh, I got 20. Oh, I got 25. And I get the dynamic of somebody who's that disenfranchised. What's hard for me to wrap my head around is some of the leadership that is so invested in power and money that humanity has completely no value at all. And I mean, it's just really, my whole life has been 180 degrees from that. So it's really hard for me to make peace with and live in this kind of world.
Thank you.
In hearing this grief and experiencing it myself, what comes to the forefront of my spirit and a question to you is, how do we navigate the feelings of, you brought up interconnectedness, how deeply interconnected we all are, and simultaneously detachment and not holding on so intrinsically to one another. Can you please speak to that in this current climate?
That's a good question.
It's a really important question.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember these 3 lines from Mary Oliver.
There are 3 things.
Where she writes, there are 3 things. To live in this life, there are 3 things you must do. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing that your life depends upon it. And then when it's time to let it go, to let it go. And so she's saying, as a poet, what you expressed so beautifully in your question, because your question also has the answer in it, that part of the paradox of being a human being, just like remembering your Buddha nature and your social security number, is that we become able to hold this world and care for it, also knowing at the same time that we don't control it, that we don't get to control the outcome. But what we do get to do is to plant beautiful seeds. And if you plant a beautiful seed, something will grow from it, whether you see it there or whether it happens in a lifetime or in your lifetime or afterward. But this is how the universe works. And so you don't get to choose the outcome. The secret is that you get to act beautifully without attachment to the fruits of the actions. You don't get to determine how it comes out, but you do get to be a human being who, in times of grief, in times of conflict, in times of pain and struggle, which we all have, you learn first the ability to tolerate that, which Trudy talked about. Neuroscience talks about the window of tolerance that can be expanded through meditation. And then you get to respond. And what seeds will you plant? And that allows you to really live in an honorable way and care without the grasping of how it's supposed to turn out. In these times, how we respond and what seeds we plant are all the more critical. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, it's about teach us to care. Am I on? Teach us to care and also not to care. How to keep our balance is really hard. Like, one of the things I worry about is becoming inured to this violence. Oh, another shooting. What do we say now? Instead of just the heartbreak and letting that in. And I think that's one of the dangerous things about what's going on in a broader way in our culture, that we would get used to it instead of being outraged. And the deeper question that I think has been named by Lisa and by you, what's your name? Alexandra. And by Alexandra is, the real question is, how can there be such, really, we don't say the word evil in this tradition because we talk about ignorance instead, but how can there be such ignorance? How can people be so cruel to other people? That is a huge question. And for people who have witnessed or been part of or documented or are awake, just to know the intensity of cruelty and pain that people are capable of deliberately inflicting on one another is it's incomprehensible, really. So thank you. Okay, Malachi, and then I think that's all. Last question or last sharing.
I was going to ask a question about like an example or a story that you might have about being with the feeling of helplessness. I think I think the point is interesting. It's something that I have just started to try and sit with, because the vapors that were above that were rage. And I didn't realize that underneath the rage I'm Irish, so it's sort of genetic, but there's also like, I think the tradition that I was raised in, there was just so much helplessness that this feeling of helplessness that I think then gave birth to rage. The thing that I just wanted to offer, it is a part of the question, but it just has to do with safety. I think that I grew up, part of how I began to feel safe was, even as a child, I felt the safest when I was alone in the forest with a gun. And I never made the connection to the gun part before, but I realized that it was because of like abuse within the community. But I think that helplessness was the feeling underneath that, because abuse, I think by definition, it's something that we experience where we can't defend ourselves. So there's a violation of our boundaries, kind of like of our sovereignty and our power. And I think that growing up in Southern Indiana, I think a lot of people, they just feel safer with a gun. And regardless of what we think about that, I think that underneath that, fundamentally, we just want to feel safe.
Right.
And so many of us do not. And I think that when helplessness gives birth to that rage, which we see in terrorism, which from a different perspective is a person who's a freedom fighter, they're refusing to allow the rest of their life to be trapped by this or caged by this feeling of helplessness and this inability. So I understand what it means to feel safer with a gun, and thankfully I think I don't mean that in like a violent way, like I like a BB gun.
No, I don't think you said that. It doesn't sound that way.
But it helped create that feeling of like, I can protect myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that where I'm able to connect sometimes in these stories, and I also teach kids yoga, and so there's also like, I'm with kids like all the time, and they live with this fear. It's just like realizing that sense of helplessness and just the fundamental desire to just feel safe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It really comes across as compassionate, not that you're espousing gun violence. So thank you. So let's sit together for a moment.
Yeah, and as you said, with the compassion that Trudy mentioned, let yourself hold everything that's been activated in you in the conversation and in the current events that we're talking about, the gun violence and shooting and all the rest of it, and let yourself sit with the great heart of compassion for your humanity, for all of our vulnerability and needs to be safe, for all our struggles as human beings, so that you can plant seeds in yourself, and as you move through this world, that are seeds of compassion and courage, well-being for all together.
So thank you, everybody, for your practice, for your presence, for your participation. And I'm going to remind you of the donate button and of the bowl outside. Please when you think of what to give, you might think of enjoying a luxurious meal. Where else could you come and spend a whole morning just being, hopefully, learning more about yourself, about life, about each other, being illuminated and awakened. And so just to consider that. I understand everybody has different capacity. For some people, going out to dinner is an unheard of, impossible luxury. There's other people in the room who could probably buy dinner for all of us. We're just a full range here. So, but just to remember whatever your capacity is to offer that. And before you leave, I do want to invite you to say hi to somebody and connect with somebody that you didn't before. And then I will wish you a very happy week, a happy day.
And as you go around this week, be extra kind to people because the world needs it, and you can do that.
And it will make you happy. See you next week. Yeah, thank you.